Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully, a few more persons will be joining us, but let's go ahead and begin. So, my name is I, representing the Pelican Book Club. We'll be discussing violence against women in collaboration with the Student Psychology Association. So, welcome, everyone. Thank you for making your best efforts to be here with us today to discuss this heavy but very important topic. So, we have a really interesting discussion about social issues and their origin within society. And uh, more importantly, how our literature and our media is shaped by these social issues. Now, violence against women and girls is one of the most widespread, persistent, and devastating human rights violations in our world today. But it remains largely underreported due to the impunity, the silence, stigma, and shame that surrounds it. And yes, it's one of many issues, but it's so pervasive and well known and common, which is kind of horrifying to think about, but just not spoken about.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Sonali. If we look at violence in general terms, it manifests itself in physical, sexual, and psychological forms, encompassing intimate partner violence, sexual violence and harassment, human trafficking, female genital mutilation, and child marriage. Suggested that we all have a formal understanding of what it is exactly. The UN defines violence against women as any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in the private life. So, Sonali, can you give us a little more insight into where this seemingly embedded culture of violence in our Caribbean community came from?
Sure thing. So, just as an additional note, what I find really interesting about the UN's definition is that it shows how universal this issue is in any society and culture and even time period. But of course, we can note that there are a high number of incidences of domestic violence here in the Caribbean context. And they can actually be traced back to the region's pre independent practices of plantation economies, enslavement, and indentureship. So the perpetuation of violence from a historical lens ensured political, social, and cultural ordering by ultimately establishing and justifying the boundaries between those who could exercise power and control, which would have been men and masculinity, and those who are likely to be the victims, which were women and children. And apart from these historical practices, violence is something that is institutionalized in the Caribbean. I mean, it's shaped by race, gender, class, and it's become part of Caribbeans' men's masculine identities and is part of their strategies for gaining and retaining power and control with their families, communities, and in most social settings. And considering this, I think we can certainly see how Caribbean contemporary societies have emerged from what many considered to be among the most violent and destructive examples of the colonization process, making violence a product of its past into today's social and cultural norms. Today, the Caribbean is a product of its past. Violence is a given norm. Both women and men are perpetrators of violence, though frequency is generally greater among men. So forgive me for rambling a bit, but what's also quite interesting is that all of this is perpetuated by our gendered socialization in the Caribbean context. It's not enough to be born male or female. This alone does not make you a man or woman. At birth, we know nothing about gender and we develop our gender identities via others, and we actively cultivate emblems of masculinity and femininity in order to pass these different social tests. And so then we should more be asking ourselves what are the traits that parents encourage their children and their sons to have? There have been perspectives that would have spoken about this, and this is interesting to ask. So, how do these behaviors impact on their male gender identity? How do these behaviors impact on the treatment of women in society? And even at the narrower level, how do mothers, female teachers, and figures shape the identity of their sons and male students?
Well, personally, it still shocks me the number of women who continue to enable men's superiority complexes and, by extension, help to cement the patriarchal systems in society. They continue to raise their sons in the practice of disrespect to other females around them, encouraging them to imitate the ways of their fathers or other males in society. They are also considerably quiet when they see their sons acting out or participating in highly immoral activities.
Yes, definitely, I would agree. But I would also add that not only that, but we also need to acknowledge that domestic violence affects not only girls but boys as well. It's something that is not always spoken about. These same systems that produce men who abuse women also produce men who abuse other men, and so on. So challenging this violence prevents a cycle from occurring in society because, of course, persons who are abused might consider this to be the norm and they might then accept it, or they might go on to inflict this same type of violence onto another person. So it's more of a situation now where not challenging the systems of gender violence that are present in our societies makes people more complicit, because it is a way of encouraging the behavior and, in consequence, allowing the ideas of patriarchy, which, by the way, is very oppressive and counterproductive. It's a system that affects both men and women and perpetuates gender prejudice and oppression to maintain its control in society. To maybe just explain this a bit more specific, masculine gender roles in particular affect men's interpersonal relationships, resulting in men and boys disproportionately being likely to perpetrate forms of violence against others and themselves. And through these patterns of exposure to violence, it's quite clear how domestic violence is reinforced in social and cultural norms through parenting and within intimate relationships. And it's quite sad to think about sometimes.
It really is quite sad to think about. So on a more depressing note, it is quite clear that in society, violence is seen as strictly a woman's issue, and that some good men help out with, when it is indeed everyone's issue. Calling it a woman's issue is part of the problem. It gives men an excuse not to pay attention. The same thing goes for gender. People tend to think that gender issues are women's issues. By doing this, the dominant groups in society do not get paid attention to. These are all ways in which dominant systems continue to maintain and reproduce themselves. They lack introspection and are rendered invisible in conversations that are primarily about them. So men have been erased completely from discourses about sexual violence. The way that we think and use language conspire to keep our attention off of men. These issues are spoken about passively, and it shifts the attention away from the perpetrator and onto the victims. Take, for example, if you see a headline in the newspaper about a female having been raped or murdered, the focus is always on the victim and not the perpetrator. We as a society need to stop saying, this happened to her, and instead say, this is what he did.
Yeah, that's an excellent example of that. I 100% agree. Now, moving on, adding to that, when we think about gender violence in literature, there are endless examples, regional and locally, that we can look through. But now we can focus on something that is perhaps a bit more mainstream and well known. I'm certain that all of us here would have heard or know who the renowned V.S. Naipaul is, and we would have read his work at some point in our lives or in our academic careers. We'd like to take a quick delve into his work today and look specifically at how he crafts gender and violence in Miguel Street. Here's a quick question for you guys first, about how he will centering on how he writes and uses his craft. Do you think that he is outright misogynistic in his writing, or do you believe that he's just misunderstood? I'd love to hear your take on that.
He's outright misogynistic in his writing.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting response. Definitely.
He uses satire to hide the misogyny, honestly. It's a disgusting way to use literature to obtain your own means and biases, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. I just really think that's so interesting to think about, especially in how it's written and how it's portrayed generally. So moving on, in his novel, Miguel Street, we see this legacy of patriarchy. It's an authentic reflection of life in a local environment. He focuses on males and maleness, leading to the literary constructions of masculinity as a depiction of life in the West Indies during a highly patriarchal era. There are a myriad of major male characters and even a major male character voice as a nameless character in the book. I mean, so potent is maleness, so supreme is androcentrism, and so powerful is masculinism that the reader does not even need a name for this character to understand him. This to all of us that there is value and merit in Naipaul's work, in that it shapes our understanding of masculinity today. What we accept as taboo and what we speak about or question, what we have not learned as a society in feeling to accept gender equality. And if we see some aspects of this novel in our life today, this is the legacy of patriarchy. Just from the name of the novel alone, we see reflection of patriarchal ideals. Miguel is traditionally a male name, and within Caribbean context, the streets have always been predominantly a male sphere. street corners were largely male populated, and here we see literature mimicking life. This novel is not at all doing females or women any good, but rather it shows the perpetuation of negative masculinities. All of these are labels, but it highlights toxic masculinity in the novel as well as in society. In the novel, for example, if you do not beat your wife, you are not a good man. But if you overbeat her, then it's not accepted. All men must treat women as objects and be dominant over them. Women who are promiscuous are labeled as harlots. Women are only good for one thing, and that is to satisfy the appetite of men and then to be discarded. They are compared to fruits, ripe for the picking and then just thrown away. Men are seen as an ideal by doing this. Their masculinity is so fragile that if you do it, then you are superior, and if you do not do it, then you are not a man. A cultivation of masculinity enabled by men and some women as well can prove to be very dangerous to society at large. This perpetuates what we know as rape culture today. In the story, Naipaul also highlights the growth and development of the narrator, who is a young, fatherless East Indian boy who is gender socialized by other males in a male gendered space, which is the same aforementioned street we would have spoken about. There are tales of glory and triumphs in personal lives, whilst the woes were when the child turned out to be a daughter and not a son. There were gendered preferences outlined where boys were seen as assets for various purposes. This is the link to the gender-based division of labor, which we won't really be getting into today. But the lives of men are explored in detail against the backdrop of a developing society with all its male-dominated institutions, including education, religion, politics, and the law.
So largely, the novel is based on how boys become men. So the term boy here is used as a biological construct, not a social one. He may display aspects of masculinity that are considered traditional, even evolving. This refers to the behaviors, attitudes, and values associated with maleness, which are strength, power, control, etc. This is solely about unequal power relations because men sometimes tend to believe that women are not meant to be their equals. This said, we acknowledge that gender-based violence is not only perpetrated against women, but also against men who are considered to be inferior according to societal standards. Men try to justify their actions. So when they rape, they try to reason it was because of the way that the woman was dressed or the way that they acted. This is a typical enactment of masculinity in society, which takes us back to the perpetuation of rape culture that Sonali previously mentioned, where rape is not about sex. It is about power relations in a sexual light. The lack of consent by a female somehow feeds into the control that some men so desperately want or need. The issue with violence against women is not women, it is the men. A woman should not have to present herself in a specific way in order to not be acted upon by portrayals of chapter 4 of the novel. Naipaul highlights the sense of ambition. The character of Elias wanted to be different than what was expected of him. He wanted to be a health inspector. But because masculinity is so prevalent in the literature, we see that because Elias was abused as a child, he turned out to be just like his father, who was the abuser. Even in contemporary times, we see that this is how masculinity is enacted, with male privilege and power being at the forefront of unequal power relations. Men by virtue of being male have power that women do not have. With Elias and his friends, they spoke of typical male associated activities that constantly categorized and objectified women. In chapter 10, which is the only chapter in the novel that Naipaul dedicated to women, he constantly discriminated against them by calling them horrible names because of their sexuality and their varying natures. The novel also showcased religion with male socialization in chapter 13, showing readers in all dimensions that violence, no matter what factor, be it wealth, religion, ethnicity, is highly pervasive. When Naipaul said that the character had to beat his wife, he shows that this was the only way he could establish his manhood. He body shamed the woman by saying that it was not easy to beat her because of the amount of flesh that she had. This highly trivialized the act of domestic violence that he was illustrating in the book. He also portrayed women as being socialized to obey their husbands, which is a very realistic scenario in the Caribbean context. The specific character aforementioned was a Hindu pandit, and his wife had to actually keep the same bag that he used to beat her with well cleaned and oiled. This is a classic enablement of toxic masculinity. All in all, we see that varying agents of male gender socialization is at play in the novel. The entirety of it was about males and male gender socialization and multiple masculinities within the Caribbean context. Naipaul highlighted that the family has been largely accepted as the primary agent of gender socialization, and that all the other major agents all serve to either endorse or refute the impact of the family. And finally, that both males and females perpetuate the practice of gender socialization and by extension, the culture of violence in the Caribbean. So male privilege in particular is an epidemic in Caribbean culture. Shia Teran describes male privilege as the concept that society presents unwarranted advantages to men simply because they are male. Unlike women, men do not have worries that their assertiveness will evoke negative attributions to their characters and subsequent backlash for their insolence. Hence, men are more vocal in their assertiveness in all aspects of their lives. Would you care to elaborate more on this, Denali?
Yeah, so to really exemplify this a bit better, let's take a look at a particular story written in a collection by Naipaul's father. This is seen in the beating of Ratney. Now, when Ratney is found by her husband cooking a dish he did not feel like eating on that particular day, instead of standing up for herself and vocalizing that she knew he liked said dish, she remained quiet throughout the abuse, not even shedding a tear. The husband, on the other hand, faced no punishments for his abuse. He utilized his privilege through his abuse to showcase his manhood because he knew that no one would oppose him. The privilege has to do with them being unconscious of it and their status. In other words, they do not have to worry about or think about their gendered identity because they subscribe to the patriarchal definition of what it means to be masculine, which is straight, domineering, and strong-minded. This being said, men's violence against women is seen as an expression of their fragile masculinity and their perpetuation of male domination and superiority. Concurrently, the adverse psychological reproductive health consequences of violence affect women at all stages of their life, which is really interesting to think about. Okay, so I'll stop now. I think I've already made my point quite clear, and I will now pass you over to the Student Psychology Association, who will speak more on the adverse psychological effects that arise from this and some of the cognitive dimensions of the portrayal of men, women, and violence in media, the role of mental health, and just expanding more on some of the ideas tackled by Naipaul and other authors.
Yeah, you guys can give some insights as well while we wait on Reseda. Give your thoughts and opinions on what was said, or not even on what was said, on your opinion itself, on your opinion on violence itself, and how you think the media perpetuates this sort of violence against women.
If you all had thoughts on any of the questions that was asked before, if you have any thoughts on Naipaul, on any of the topics we would have mentioned, you feel free to share them. We would love to hear from you in the meantime.
You can share your thoughts in the chat as well. You don't have to turn on your mics to speak if you're not comfortable.
Well, I must say that you all put it together very well. You all basically say everything that I was thinking about, just in a more organized way. But I would like to add that when I was in this class called Criminal Justice System, my lecturer, he mentioned this phrase in London, I believe, called riding the donkey backwards. And that is when a man is a victim of domestic violence. And that is to show that they encourage violence amongst men, that encourage men to be, well, men supposed to be violent. If you are the victim of domestic violence, well, you are riding the donkey backwards, as the phrase said. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, it's almost a sort of kind of joke in our culture as well. When we hear that men are victims of violence, especially at the hands of a woman, it's a very backward way of thinking, in my opinion. And this is why most men who are victims, they don't come out and say anything about it because they are ashamed, and this culture that we perpetuate with this shaming, it's very, I don't know what's the word to put it in, but they're very sad to think about. I don't know.
Exactly, especially in these modern times. I mean, 2021, and it's still a shame for men to come out and say, well, listen, I've been abused by my wife, I've been abused by my girlfriend, I've been sexually abused, this and that. They will laugh at them, they won't take them seriously. Like Johnny Depp, I don't know if you all know about the case of Johnny Depp. If you all heard about it, he has been abused, and people, they don't take it as seriously as they do with us. Sorry to say, but that's just the truth.
It is the
truth.
truth.
It's like they are encouraging men to be the perpetrators.
I agree with you.
Okay, so I tried to move away from the construction. All right, sorry about that, y'all. But based on what I have heard, it's true how people would conceive violence between both genders would always be portrayed differently. And then it also brings into the question about what about people who you don't consider, well, Caribbean wise, they don't consider transgender to be a legitimate gender, or they don't consider other people, let's say, of different sexualities or orientations, to have a voice in terms of violence and what justice needs to be done. So it's always it's not just one branch of violence. You have to look at it multiple, and it puts in perspective. If I have to look at it from a psychological standpoint, there's something called availability heuristics. This basically means what is easily accessible to our knowledge and what we make judgments upon. So social-wise, we actually primed into accepting different things from a young age. So you will hear parents will usually tell their children, whether they're joking or not, that they better not see, if you're a girl, they better not see you dating another girl, don't bring another girl home. They say things like this, and it primes you to think that, okay, these sorts of things aren't acceptable. Now, they prime you have a say over what you can and place if you think they're getting out of line. And sometimes you don't realize this, but whether they tell you this directly or indirectly, and indirectly can be, let's say, you see them lying at the bar and they will say this over a drunk stupor, it still perpetuates the fact that you're primed at a young age to think that this is normal behavior. So basically, at this young age, you don't know anything else. You are forced to stick within this box they have placed you in. And all this information you've gathered, you don't have anything to compare to anything else to judge if it is right or if it is wrong. And because of this limited information you have from a young age, it becomes more difficult to make judgments. So similarly, it should be noted that our biases, derive from this lack of information and time to rationalize that this is wrong or this is right, or this shouldn't be the way it is, because all of us are humans, all of us have emotional needs, and it should not be ignored. But again, because of the lack of information or because you've been primed, it's simply difficult to do. And there's something I wanted to mention as an example. So men will view expression of gentleness or affection as signs of weaknesses. And in my opinion, 100% misguided by this thinking and perception that is a threat to their identity as a male. And this is actually linked to social perception in the eyes of the public. And we don't realize it, but we are on a small island and we haven't realized it yet, but we become very dependent upon the views of everybody else on the island. Because as they say, small island people just talk. People just talk, people just view concern about what others would say positively about them. So if the majority of the public will say that it is fine if you see a couple fighting, leave them alone to their own devices. If you see the woman is getting hurt, don't intervene, it's not your place. And that is a lot of what we can identify with as children, especially if in terms of when we have to make a report to the police, they'll be like, we thought it was a family dispute, we weren't going to get involved. Saying that, do something, they don't do that. So it's important to look at all these aspects, and it shows how in-depth it is psychologically, or how ingrained it is psychologically, whether you are accepted or not, based on what you think of it from a sociological standpoint as well. And now I need to say, if we have to look at this aspect of media, regardless of whether it's traditional like books or contemporary like social media apps, under the psychological lens, we can look at a theory we use in psych. It's by Maslow, we call it the hierarchy of needs. It basically refers to your needs for belonging, your needs for acceptance, and it's based on a certain criteria. I'm going to talk specifically about individuals and how their understanding of identity and gender norms are shaped by different things portrayed by the media that give you this sense of belongingness. And this actually makes you very susceptible to conditions that would yield a sense of, acceptance from the mainstream public. So what this means is that the media throughout our Caribbean history has enabled us to seek out gratification from others for the sense of belongingness, a sense of who you are expected to be and what society deems appropriate. So it's not always about what you want to portray, it's about you have to rationalize what society would accept, or I should say, demean you for. So we've seen it. We've always seen it. We've developed our own way of rationalizing and deriving a sense of, let's say, sexuality or gender-specific behavior to those of the opposite sex, so like male to female relations, from what is presented to us through these mediums. So I'll give you an example. Katrina and Sai already talked about V.S. Naipaul, but there's also authors like Sam Selvon and Marlon James, and they have relayed the colonial and post-colonial norms where the issue of beating a woman for the most trivial of things was desensitized to the point of it being accepted for what it was, and without any attempt of nipping it in the bud. And I'll give you an example. Marlon James, he's a Jamaican author, and he spoke a lot about post-colonial themes. And there was one in particular about homophobic jargon that was used in Jamaica, and it is still much present today. One of them in particular, and I'm going to quote it, with quotes such as "Batty boy," "you hate for those who male to male intimate relations," and that the violence against them was perfectly acceptable because people didn't accept it and they thought it was all right to outright have violence against them. And there was no justification to go and defend them. But at the same time, in the same story, when women were being beaten for simply not being able to get the food on time, there was still no attempt to defend these women. So it puts into perspective what society deems as appropriate. And like I said, if they are primed this way from a young age to think that this is how it should be, this is how order is maintained, they will act in a violent way to adhere to these norms to make sure they haven't lost their social control of what is supposed to be their ideal society. And if we have to look at the 21st century today, it really is a big shame that this still happens and that the youth are the ones, at most times, are the ones who are trying to speak up on it. So 21st century, we still have youth having to advocate for justice of women or the violence against women. And most of the times, have we realized that it's because of the youth we are actually trying to advocate for us amongst our ages And basically, we're trying to educate those of the older generation. It is those of the older generation who actually reinforce the old norms of patriarchy, and that there's nothing that needs to be done, that needs to be changed. And especially because our justice system is still have a lot of work to be done. You still want to say you want to advocate for women's safety, but yet our laws, we don't have certain structures in place, we don't have certain policies in place. I believe, want to say that you're advocating for us, but there's nothing being put in place, solidified yet, to say that we are protected or that something is being done right now. It really does put in perspective what people would advocate for based on what they think as important right now. And I want to touch on the media part now. So the media part, we all know that whether it's books or social media, our way of thinking is shaped by it. The books written by these authors would shape the older individuals because our older generation was shaped by these novels. So it will linger with them, it reinforce that priming from a young age. So they will think this is what it is, it should remain that way. The youth, on the other hand, have been exposed to a different medium. We know of the books, yes, but we also have access across the board to other platforms. So we have blogs, through movies, and we've used this to actually shape a different understanding of what is acceptable in terms of male to female relations and where violence is considered. So there's another psychological concept I'd like to touch on. It's about informational social influence. Basically what it is about conformity. Based on the different information we receive, we conform our thoughts, we change it to different ideals. What is accepted and what we think we should try to understand to get a different input, I should say. So during the time for the advocacy, we saw a lot of people sharing it on Facebook, stand up for women's rights, so share these links. And to be quite honest, most people would do it because that was what was considered trending. And again, linked to conformity. They think you need to comply with this right now. It is a prevalent matter right now. However, we saw that in the days afterwards, 2-3 days afterwards, it didn't have as much momentum as it did initially. Now that goes to show that this conformity doesn't last that long. It depends on how long you're able to keep it up or how long you see the media being covered by it. So these are all things to consider in terms of humans, and humans are very complex. You will stick to one thing for a certain amount of time and then it will fade off and you go to another thing afterwards. This is why it's important that we need to learn what we can integrate into society from a young age. And I keep emphasizing on this because if we don't start from those that are younger, as they get older, they won't be able to differentiate between what is acceptable, what isn't, and they're just about long-term consequences. So this is important and we need to think about it a lot more. And we don't realize it, but we are very vulnerable and impressionable people. And most of us are struggling to accept what is okay and what isn't okay. So there's a debate about if a woman, let's say, provokes a man, if it is okay for the man to hit her, or vice versa. And this is actually a very difficult one to touch on because we still don't know how to really define what is right and wrong according to morality's sake, let's say. What we should all learn from a young age and learn to accept is that based on human decency, you aren't supposed to resort to violence, no matter what it is. If it is that you need to defend yourself, don't end up provoking it more. Don't try to actually attack, just defend yourself and try to make the reports. But again, we need to learn difference. We need to learn how to help one another. We know how to look for certain cues and try not to hide yourself from it because you know it, you see it very small times too, and you have an idea, but at the same time, someone tells you to stay quiet. It should not be that way. We need to learn, if you can conform to what is popular on social media, why not conform to the ideal of what is basic human decency and courtesy? Consider, we've heard this big too. A lot of these people from these homes, they are scared. They don't think that the system works for them. And quite frankly, the system is not going to work unless the community takes a step up. Unless the communities learn that they need to start doing more in order to make these systems start working for them better as what they would like. It starts from there. So that's basically both my psychological and sociological standpoint